The warp, a term that sends a chill down the spine of anyone familiar with the dark, twisted future of Warhammer 40K. It's not just some far-off dimension or source of raw energy. It is an entity unto itself, a chaotic, ever-shifting realm that defies the rules of reality. In the grimdark future, the warp is a place where time doesn't flow. The laws of physics are nothing more than suggestions, and what you encounter is as likely to tear your mind apart as it is to grant you untold power. It's both a source of hope and horror for the inhabitants of the galaxy. For humanity, it's the very lifeblood of space travel. Without the warp, the Imperium of Man would not be the sprawling empire it is, with its vast fleets of ships, colonies on 1,000 worlds, and the strange, complex mechanisms that keep the Emperor's will alive. Yet, it is also the birthplace of some of the darkest entities in existence. The gods of chaos, twisted beings of immense power, use the warp as both their home and their hunting ground, feeding off the emotions, hopes, and fears of the material universe. The warp is a necessary evil. Its existence is what makes faster-than-light travel possible through the use of warp drives. But to tap into its powers is to risk losing oneself to madness, temptation, or worse, the chaos entities that dwell within. The question remains, though, what is the warp truly? Is it just a realm of dark energy, or is there something far more sinister and alive lurking within its depths? Some say it has a mind of its own, others that it is simply a chaotic reflection of the emotions and desires of sentient beings. Whatever the truth may be, one thing is for certain. The warp is not something that should ever be trifled with, and yet, the universe can't seem to exist without it. When we dive into the question of whether the warp is a living entity, we're treading into dangerous waters, waters that have the potential to break your mind if you think too long on them. There are theories out there, born from the deepest, most unsettling corners of the Warhammer 40K universe, that suggest the warp might be much more than an intangible void or chaotic energy source. Some say it is a conscious being, a sentient force that sees, feels, and even desires. But the thought of it and the implications of such a theory are enough to send shivers down the spine of even the most hardened warriors of the Imperium. To start, let's consider what we know. The warp is undeniably connected to the emotions and psyche of sentient beings. It's like a mirror to the universe, reflecting the collective hopes, fears, and desires of everyone within it. This is why it's often described as a realm of emotion or an immaterium, a space where nothing exists but raw, unfiltered psychic energy. Now, many believe that this vast ocean of emotion can't simply be inert or lifeless. After all, the Chaos Gods themselves, the most dominant and malevolent powers within the warp, are beings of immense power, each one representing a different facet of existence, like change, decay, and violence. But to think that the warp could have birthed them, creatures that represent abstract concepts like rage, pleasure, and despair, is to entertain the notion that the warp itself is not only aware, but may be actively shaping the very universe it infects. Now, the idea that the warp might be alive isn't a new one. Fans and theorists have speculated for years about the possibility. Some believe the warp is an ancient consciousness, an entity that predates even the galaxy itself. This being, they say, might not only influence events but could be actively guiding them, manipulating emotions and desires to fulfill some grand, incomprehensible purpose. Imagine for a moment that the warp isn't just some dark, empty space between worlds. It's a vast, living mind, one that doesn't think like we do. Perhaps it is a force of creation and destruction, at war with itself, shaped by the countless millions of thoughts that pass through it like currents of a river. Perhaps, like a garden, it's tended by the Chaos Gods as gardeners tend their plants, nourishing them with the emotions of mortals, giving birth to new life and death in its twisting, horrific form. There's also the question of whether the warp has desires. Is it only a passive vessel for the emotions of others, or does it have its own purpose, its own will? We've seen hints of this throughout the Warhammer 40k lore. The way it fights back against the Emperor's attempts to restrict it, the way it entices psychers and mortals alike with promises of power. These are signs of something with intent. It might not express its desires in a way that's understandable to us, but then again, are we even equipped to comprehend the thought processes of a being that exists beyond our understanding of space, time, and even life itself? Think of the way the warp interacts with humanity. From the Emperor's desperate attempts to build the webway, to the countless psychers who have succumbed to its call, the warp seems to have a magnetic pull on the minds of mortals. It offers power, knowledge, and a taste of the infinite. Yet, it also destroys. The Imperium has long understood that any interaction with the warp is a dangerous game. The Emperor knew that even the smallest mistake could lead to the loss of countless souls, and yet it was the very source of humanity's greatest triumphs and most devastating failures. The fact that the warp can manipulate the minds of so many across such vast distances, drawing them into its web of deceit, suggests that it is not just a passive energy field. It acts with purpose, sometimes subtle, sometimes overt. This notion of the warp as a living entity also feeds into the darker theories surrounding its origins. Some have speculated that the warp is not a creation of the universe, but a natural force of reality, older than the galaxies themselves. Maybe, in the beginning, it was nothing more than a primordial soup of emotions and desires, until the first sentient beings in the universe stumbled upon it, awakened its latent consciousness, and gave it purpose. If the warp is alive, it may have always been alive, merely waiting for the right moment to manifest its true nature. And if that's true, could the warp be older than even the Chaos Gods themselves? Could it be that they are merely aspects of the warp's desire to shape the universe, and not its true essence? On the flip side, there are those who argue that the warp is simply a reflection of the universe's emotions and desires, a necessary evil born of sentient beings and their actions. In this view, the warp doesn't have a consciousness. It's just the chaos of the universe itself, manifesting in a way that we're unable to comprehend. It's nothing more than the subconscious expression of all that is created, destroyed, and dreamed in the material universe. To these thinkers, the Chaos Gods are not actual deities or beings of pure power, but projections of the universal forces of change, death, and entropy. But no matter which side of the argument you fall on, the idea that the warp might be a living, thinking entity is an unsettling one. If the warp is truly alive, what does that mean for the Imperium and the rest of the galaxy? Does it watch us, waiting for the right moment to strike? Or is it simply a passive observer, indifferent to the lives it manipulates? Could it be a force that's working against the will of the Chaos Gods? Or is it in league with them, feeding them the power they need to spread their influence? And if the warp has its own desires, does it want something from us? Something beyond the endless suffering it already causes? The truth might be more complex than any of us can imagine, and maybe that's why the warp continues to be one of the most terrifying and fascinating aspects of the Warhammer 40k universe. No matter how much we learn about it, there will always be more questions, more mysteries, and more fear lurking just beneath the surface. Because, at the end of the day, the warp isn't just a force. It's a mystery that we may never fully understand, and perhaps that's exactly what it wants. The warp is not just a backdrop to the events of Warhammer 40k, but an essential force that underpins the entire universe. It is the lifeblood of space travel, the conduit through which psychers channel their incredible powers, and the source of the universe's most dangerous and chaotic phenomena. In many ways, the warp functions as the engine that drives reality itself. Without it, the galaxy would be far more isolated, and the Imperium's sprawling empire would be nothing but a series of disconnected worlds. But what truly makes the warp so crucial to the material universe? What is its true role in the grand scheme of existence? Let's start by considering how the warp connects different realities. In the simplest terms, it is the link between the material universe and the immaterium, that bizarre, otherworldly realm where time and space bend and twist beyond recognition. The warp isn't just a place, it's a bridge. It allows the material world to interact with forces beyond comprehension, with beings that transcend the laws of reality. The immaterium itself is constantly shifting, its tides controlled by the emotions and thoughts of those who inhabit the material universe. The warp doesn't just reflect reality, it shapes it, for good or ill, depending on how one taps into its power. Space travel is the first and most obvious function of the warp in the Warhammer 40K universe. Without the warp, humanity would never have ventured far beyond Earth. Warp drives are what make faster-than-light travel possible, allowing fleets of massive warships to cross the galaxy in mere weeks or months, rather than centuries. But while this is the most well-known aspect of the warp's influence, it's also the most dangerous. Navigators, those gifted individuals who guide ships through the warp, are essential to this process, and they are constantly at risk of being pulled into the madness that lurks within. They rely on the guidance of the Emperor's light, or more often, the fortuitous gifts of the gods of chaos. There is something inherently unsettling about the fact that, to move through the stars, humanity has to rely on something as fundamentally unpredictable as the warp. It is an ever-present reminder that the universe is not as stable as we might like to believe. But it's not just travel that the warp facilitates. It's the very nature of psychic powers that gives the warp its deeper significance. Psychers, those individuals with the ability to channel the energy of the warp, are both revered and feared throughout the galaxy. For humanity, Psychers are a necessary evil. They are the tools used by the Imperium to maintain control over the galaxy, but they are also potential time bombs, capable of unleashing chaos and destruction on a massive scale. The Psychers draw their power from the warp, tapping into its raw energy, but doing so comes with a price. It's said that the warp doesn't give power freely, it demands something in return. Every use of psychic power is a small step toward madness, corruption, or worse. Many believe that the warp feeds on the souls of Psychers, consuming them slowly over time until they break under the strain. And yet, the Imperium continues to rely on these dangerous individuals, knowing that without them, its vast empire would crumble. Then there's the fact that the warp connects all of reality in a way we can scarcely understand. It is said that everything in the material universe has a counterpart in the immaterium. Every thought, every emotion, every event, every life, each of these is reflected, magnified, and distorted in the warp. The emotions of sentient beings feed the chaos that inhabits the immaterium, and in turn, the chaos influences the thoughts and desires of the material universe. This relationship between the two realms is not simply one of passive reflection either. The warp has an active role in shaping the events of the material world. The desire for power, for dominance, for destruction, all of these can be amplified by the warp, and in some cases, even manipulated by the chaos gods themselves. The entire cycle of the universe, it seems, is powered by the interaction between the material world and the warp. And yet, for all its power and importance, the warp remains shrouded in mystery. It is something that the greatest minds of the Imperium, and indeed the galaxy, can barely begin to comprehend. The warp has no clear boundaries, no defined limits. It doesn't behave according to the rules of reality, and it constantly changes, just as the emotions that shape it do. The warp doesn't exist in a linear fashion, like the material universe. Time and space are warped within its confines, creating pockets of reality that are as unpredictable as they are dangerous. There's no real way of measuring the warp, of understanding its scope or limits. It's an ever-present force, moving with a momentum all its own. Many theorists have speculated that the warp's interaction with the material universe is not just a passive one. Some believe that the warp is, in a way, a living entity, an intelligence that influences events in the material world for reasons known only to it. Could it be that the warp is actively trying to shape the future of the galaxy? Perhaps it has its own motives, its own desires for the material universe. This theory would explain the way the warp seemingly reacts to events, as though it's aware of what is happening within the galaxy. Some fans even believe that the Chaos Gods are merely servants of the warp, embodiments of its primal desires, rather than independent beings in their own right. If this is true, it raises the question of whether the warp itself is pushing the universe towards some unknown endgame, guiding the actions of mortals like pieces on a chessboard. Others believe that the warp is simply a reflection of the collective psyche of sentient beings, a place where their emotions and desires come to life in distorted, terrifying forms. According to this view, the warp is not a sentient entity but a passive force, one that is shaped entirely by the thoughts and feelings of those who exist within the material universe. It's an idea that suggests that the warp is a mirror, not a creator, reflecting the chaos of the material world and amplifying it, but without any active intent of its own. In this view, the Chaos Gods are nothing more than the manifestations of the darker aspects of the human and alien psyche. They are not independent beings, but creations of the warp itself, driven by the desires and fears of those who interact with it. Whatever the truth may be, one thing is certain. The warp's role in the universe is far more significant than most realize. It is both the source of great power and the breeding ground for unimaginable horrors. It connects the material universe to forces beyond our comprehension, and in doing so, it shapes the very fabric of reality. The warp is the silent architect of the galaxy's fate, whether we like it or not. The relationship between humanity and the warp is one of the most complex and paradoxical dynamics in the Warhammer 40K universe. Humanity has always existed on the edge of this dark, dangerous, and unpredictable force. On one hand, the warp is essential to humanity's existence, powering the vast interstellar empire known as the Imperium of Man. Without it, the human race would be forever confined to one world, unable to spread across the stars or interact with other species in the galaxy. On the other hand, the warp is also a constant threat, a malevolent force that feeds off human emotion and is the birthplace of some of the most terrifying entities in existence. This duality, the necessity of the warp for survival and the danger it poses, has shaped humanity's relationship with the Immaterium throughout its history. At the heart of this delicate balance lies the Emperor of Mankind, the greatest psyker the galaxy has ever known. His efforts to protect humanity from the warp have been as much about survival as they have been about control. The Emperor's primary goal during the Great Crusade was not just to unify humanity under the banner of the Imperium, but to protect them from the very forces of chaos that seek to destroy everything they had built. The Emperor, for all his wisdom and power, understood that humanity was vulnerable to the warp in ways no other race truly was. While other species, such as the Eldar, had learned to control their relationship with the warp, humanity had been left exposed. The creation of psykers, those gifted or cursed with the ability to tap into the warp, was both a blessing and a curse. Psykers were a necessary tool for the Emperor's grand vision, but they also carried the risk of falling prey to the darker aspects of the warp. The Emperor's psychic prowess was unmatched, but even he knew that no mortal could be fully immune to the temptations and dangers that lurked within the Immaterium. One of the most significant actions the Emperor took in this regard was his attempt to shield humanity from the full brunt of the warp's destructive potential. Through the creation of the Astronomicon, the Emperor provided humanity with a psychic beacon that allowed ships to navigate the warp safely. This was a vital innovation. Without the Astronomicon, the Imperium would have been unable to maintain its empire, as travel across the stars would have been impossible. However, this beacon came with a heavy price. The Emperor, who was already deeply involved in maintaining the Astronomicon, became a living sacrifice, his psychic energy consumed by the beacon every moment of his existence. In a way, the Emperor's very life was tethered to the warp, and in a twisted sense, it was the warp that kept him alive. But while the Emperor's efforts were crucial in keeping humanity safe, they were far from perfect. The warp, with its vast and ever-shifting nature, is not something that can be fully controlled or tamed. Even the Emperor, with all his power, could not eliminate the Chaos Gods or the temptations they offered. The Warhammer 40K universe is rife with tales of psychers, men and women with immense psychic power, falling victim to the chaos that lies within the warp. Some succumb to madness, while others are twisted into the twisted servants of the Chaos Gods. And this vulnerability has never been more apparent than during the events of the Horus Heresy, where the Emperor's own son, Horus, was swayed by the promises of chaos and turned against his father and the Imperium. The Horus Heresy remains the most significant failure in the Emperor's grand design, for it exposed the limits of his power and the inescapable truth that the warp could never be fully controlled. Even the Emperor, with all his foresight and power, could not anticipate how far-reaching the influence of the warp would be. The betrayal of Horus and the subsequent war that tore the galaxy apart proved that the warp was not simply a force to be managed. It was a living, breathing entity that had its own desires and could not be easily restrained. However, even in the wake of this catastrophic failure, the Emperor's vision never truly faltered. The Imperium continued to wage war against the forces of chaos, and humanity continued to rely on the Psychers who had become so vital to its survival. It was not just the Emperor's psychic strength that held the Imperium together, but the endless tide of Psychers that poured forth from Terra and other worlds. These Psychers were essential not just for their ability to guide the Imperium's ships through the warp, but also for the powerful rituals and psychic defenses that kept the Imperium's enemies at bay. The Inquisition, in particular, became the great arbiter of psychic power, ensuring that no Psyker went unchecked, while also hunting down those who were seduced by the warp. But what of the Psychers themselves? Their role in the Imperium is a paradox in itself. They are both revered and feared, seen as tools of immense power, yet also as dangerous liabilities. It's a relationship built on necessity, as humanity relies on Psychers to protect its empire, but it is also fraught with risk, as the power drawn from the warp comes at a cost. To be a Psyker is to constantly walk a tightrope between serving the Emperor and succumbing to the temptations of chaos. Many Psychers are driven mad by their powers, or worse, corrupted into agents of chaos. The Emperor, in his efforts to control this vast psychic potential, sought to limit the influence of Psychers wherever possible, even instituting the horrifying exterminatus orders to wipe out entire worlds if a Psyker's power grew too uncontrollable. The Grey Knights, the Emperor's most elite warriors, were created to specifically hunt down and eliminate any who fell prey to the warp's influence. Yet, despite the Emperor's best efforts, humanity's relationship with the warp remains fraught with danger. Even in the wake of the Horus Heresy, the warp continues to shape the lives of mortals across the galaxy. The Chaos Gods still seek to corrupt and manipulate, and humanity, despite its technological prowess, remains at the mercy of the Immaterium. The Imperium may have created the Astronomicon and the Grey Knights, but in the end, it is only a small measure of control over an otherwise uncontrollable force. Humanity's reliance on the warp may be necessary for survival, but it's also a constant reminder that in the Warhammer 40K universe, nothing is ever truly safe, not even the Emperor himself. The Chaos Gods, those terrifying and incomprehensible entities that reign over the warp, are more than just gods in the traditional sense. They are the embodiment of raw, untamed emotions, each one representing an aspect of existence so powerful and primal that it can shape the very fabric of reality itself. Unlike the gods of most mythologies, the Chaos Gods are not concerned with creation in the conventional sense. They are beings of destruction, consumption, and perpetual change. Their influence on the warp is not just a matter of their presence. It is their existence that shapes the immaterium into something far more than a passive force. They are the warp made manifest, and the warp itself is a reflection of their desires. Each of the four major Chaos Gods, Khorne, Tzeentch, Nurgle, and Slaanesh, represents a different aspect of the emotions that dominate sentient life. Khorne is the god of war, violence, and bloodshed, a force that thrives on hatred and rage. His very presence stirs up anger, conflict, and destruction, and he is worshipped by those who revel in bloodlust and combat. Tzeentch, the Changer of Ways, is the god of change, mutation, and manipulation. He embodies ambition, scheming, and the pursuit of power, constantly twisting reality to his will and guiding mortals toward ever-shifting, unpredictable paths. Nurgle, the Lord of Decay, represents death, disease, and entropy. His domain is one of corruption, rot, and stagnation, and he draws strength from despair, illness, and the slow, inevitable march toward ruin. Finally, Slaanesh, the Dark Prince of Pleasure, is the god of excess, indulgence, and hedonism. Slaanesh feeds on desire, addiction, and the pursuit of personal satisfaction, drawing power from the endless craving for sensation, whether it be physical, emotional, or spiritual. But what is truly fascinating and deeply unsettling is that the Chaos Gods are not just abstract concepts. They are as real as the material universe itself, and their power is far more than just symbolic. They exist within the warp, but their influence extends far beyond that. The warp is their domain, their playground, their very essence, and they bend it to their whims. The Chaos Gods are not passive observers of the universe. They are active participants, shaping the fate of all who live within the material realm. To them, the material universe is little more than a battlefield, a place where they can sow their influence, shape mortal desires, and ultimately gain more power. Each of the Chaos Gods has its own desires, its own grand plan for the universe, though these desires often conflict with one another. Khorne, for example, seeks total war and violence, his only goal being the eradication of all who would stand in his way. He sees weakness as the greatest sin and thrives on the destruction of all that is unworthy. Khorne's followers, the brutal and violent warriors known as the World Eaters and countless others, are constantly waging wars, fighting battles, and slaughtering all who cross their path in the name of their god. There is no compromise with Khorne, only bloodshed, and in that bloodshed he finds his power. Tzeentch, on the other hand, is far more subtle in his approach. Where Khorne craves instant gratification, Tzeentch is patient and manipulative, always seeking to bend others to his will through cunning, deception, and the promise of power. Tzeentch's followers, the Thousand Sons sorcerers, and countless schemers, are always plotting, always seeking ways to twist the fabric of reality itself. Tzeentch is less concerned with immediate violence and more focused on long-term systemic change. His grand schemes stretch out across millennia, his influence infecting the very political and social structures of the galaxy. The more unstable the galaxy becomes, the stronger Tzeentch grows. Then there is Nurgle, the god of decay and entropy, whose desires are perhaps the most tragic of all. Nurgle is not interested in the destruction of life in a violent, explosive sense. Instead, he revels in the slow, inevitable decay of all things. He is the god of disease, sickness, and the inevitable collapse of all things living. Nurgle's followers, the Plague Marines and the Typhus, spread his influence wherever they go, slowly but surely wearing down the spirit and the flesh of their victims. Nurgle's power is not in the sudden collapse of worlds, but in their gradual erosion. His followers believe that in suffering, they find salvation, and in decay, they find peace. To Nurgle, death is not something to fear. It is merely the beginning of a new cycle, a cycle that he controls. Slaanesh is perhaps the most paradoxical of the Chaos Gods. Born from the excesses of the Eldar Empire, Slaanesh is the god of indulgence and excess. Where Khorne seeks destruction, Slaanesh seeks to satisfy every possible desire. The Dark Prince thrives on sensation, on pleasure, on the pursuit of personal fulfillment, no matter the cost. Slaanesh's followers, the decadent and often depraved cults, are obsessed with indulgence, whether it be in the pursuit of physical pleasure, artistic creation, or even the consumption of others for satisfaction. Slaanesh represents the dark side of excess, the constant craving for more that ultimately consumes the individual. But in the end, the pursuit of satisfaction becomes the pursuit of emptiness, as each indulgence only leaves the follower craving something more. Slaanesh's influence is pervasive, feeding on the desires of mortals and pushing them into a never-ending cycle of addiction and yearning. What makes these gods so powerful is not just their ability to inspire, manipulate, and control, but the fact that they are reflections of the darkest aspects of sentient beings. They are not born from nothing. They are the product of emotions, desires, and actions that exist across the galaxy. The warp, as chaotic as it is shaped by the collective emotions of all living beings, and the Chaos Gods represent the extreme manifestations of these emotions. Khorne is the rage that burns in the hearts of mortals. Tzeentch is the ambition that drives people to sacrifice everything for power. Nurgle is the inevitable decay that all life faces, and Slaanesh is the insatiable hunger for pleasure and satisfaction. They are not external forces. They are the culmination of everything that mortals feel but cannot control. The Chaos Gods are also deeply intertwined with the warp itself. They are the warp's heart and soul, its guiding influence, and they draw their power directly from it. The warp is the very fabric of their existence, and their desires are what fuel it. The more mortals give in to the emotions that these gods represent, the more power the gods gain. The warp is not just a realm of energy. It is a realm of constant emotional and psychic warfare, and the Chaos Gods are the combatants in that war. Each of them seeks to tip the balance of the warp in their favor, to exert their influence over the galaxy, and to draw the souls of mortals into their respective domains. Ultimately, the Chaos Gods are not simply creatures of destruction. They are a necessary part of the universe, representing forces that must exist for the balance of reality to remain intact. Without war, there can be no peace. Without ambition, there can be no progress. Without decay, there can be no rebirth. And without indulgence, there can be no understanding of what it means to suffer. The Chaos. Gods are not purely evil. They are simply forces of nature, born from the deepest desires of sentient beings, and they will continue to shape the fate of the universe, whether we like it or not. The warp's influence extends far beyond humanity. It touches every faction, every race, and every corner of the galaxy in ways both subtle and overt. The Eldar, the Orcs, the Necrons, these races and many others have all felt the pull of the warp, each responding to its chaotic forces in unique and often tragic ways. Some are shaped by the warp, their very existence tied to it, while others have fought to resist or even escape its influence. Understanding the warp's effect on these races is crucial to grasping the larger cosmic struggle in the Warhammer 40K universe. The Eldar are perhaps the most profoundly affected by the warp. In fact, their entire civilization was built upon the manipulation of the immaterium. The Eldar are highly psychic beings, their minds intricately connected to the warp. In the earliest days of their empire, they harnessed the power of the warp to fuel their technology and their societies. It was through their mastery of the warp that the Eldar reached the pinnacle of their achievements, creating some of the most advanced and powerful constructs the galaxy has ever known. But, as with all things in the grimdark future, this power came at a steep price. The warp, in its essence, is a place of emotions, of raw psychic energy, and the Eldar, being deeply attuned to it, could not escape the consequences of their own actions. Their excessive indulgence in pleasure, luxury, and excess, whether in their physical lives or in their pursuit of psychic power, gave birth to Slaanesh, the chaos god of excess and indulgence. The birth of Slaanesh caused the fall of the Eldar, a cataclysmic event that shattered their empire and left them broken and scattered across the galaxy. The creation of Slaanesh tore the very fabric of the Eldar's existence, and since then, they have been haunted by the knowledge that their own excesses gave birth to the Chaos God. This tragic history is a constant reminder to the Eldar of the danger the warp represents. They have spent millennia trying to rebuild and protect what remains of their once great civilization, seeking to avoid the pitfalls of their past. The Eldar, however, are not the only race shaped by the warp. The Orcs, for all their seemingly carefree nature, are also intricately tied to the Immaterium. Orcs are a chaotic, unpredictable race, driven by an innate psychic power that they do not fully understand. This psychic energy is a fundamental part of Orc physiology, and it is said to be one of the reasons why they are so dangerous. Their ability to shape reality through sheer belief, what Orcs call Wa energy, is a direct manifestation of the warp's influence. Orcs do not have the same kind of conscious control over the warp as the Eldar or the Imperium's Psykers, but they channel its power nonetheless, often in ways that are utterly destructive. The Orcs' connection to the warp is somewhat accidental, as their psychic abilities are more a product of their crude, anarchic society than any deliberate manipulation of the Immaterium. Nevertheless, the warp is what gives Orcs their strength, their resilience, and their overwhelming numbers. It is why they are able to defy logic and physics, turning junk into functional weapons or machines simply by believing it will work. This reliance on belief and emotion, in a sense, makes the Orcs a direct product of the warp. They live in a state of constant war, chaos, and unpredictability, and the more they fight, the more their psychic power grows. The warp feeds off their emotions and actions, amplifying the Orcs' destructive potential and turning them into a never-ending tide of aggression. Interestingly, Orc society and their relationship with the warp serve as a stark contrast to that of the Eldar. While the Eldar's advanced psychic knowledge led to their downfall, the Orcs' lack of understanding of the warp makes them more dangerous in some ways. They are, in a sense, unintentional agents of the warp's chaos, tapping into its power without truly comprehending its nature. Some fans speculate that the Orcs might even be more than just a race of mindless warriors. They may be the warp's response to the Eldar's excesses, a way for the Immaterium to create something that balances out the arrogance and indulgence of the Eldar with a raw, primal force of its own. Orcs embody the chaotic unpredictability of the warp, and in their own bizarre way, they are as much a part of it as any of the Chaos Gods themselves. The Necrons, however, have a different relationship with the warp entirely. Unlike the Eldar or the Orcs, the Necrons have always been a race of materialists, beings who seek to understand and control the physical universe rather than the psychic or spiritual realms. The Necrons, once a highly advanced species known as the Necrontire, rejected the warp and all its corrupting influence. Their history is one of an obsessive pursuit of immortality, driven by a fear of the unknown forces that govern existence. When they encountered the Citan, the star gods who offered them the promise of eternal life, they rejected the idea of the warp and instead turned to technology to overcome their natural limitations. The result was the transformation of the Necrontyr into the Necrons, a race of immortal, machine-like beings whose souls were severed from the warp entirely. The Necrons' rejection of the warp was both a blessing and a curse. While they gained immortality and immunity to the dangers of the warp, they lost something essential in the process: their connection to the immaterium, their emotions, and their very souls. The Necrons are, in a sense, a dead race, trapped in a mechanical shell, unable to truly connect with the life force of the galaxy. Their rejection of the warp may have saved them from the Chaos Gods, but it also condemned them to an eternity of soulless existence. Interestingly, despite their attempts to escape the warp, the Necrons are not entirely immune to its influence. The Citan, the gods they served, were once beings of immense power drawn from the warp, and even the Necrons themselves can feel its touch, albeit in a muted, distant way. The Necrons' refusal to embrace the warp has created an eternal struggle for them as they seek to conquer the galaxy without ever truly understanding the forces that shape it. Some theorists believe that, in the end, the Necrons' inability to tap into the warp might be their undoing. They may be impervious to its corruption, but they also lack the power that the other races draw from it. As we look at the ways the warp influences these three distinct races, the Eldar, the Orcs, and the Necrons, it becomes clear that the warp is more than just a force of destruction. It is a reflection of the desires, fears, and ambitions of every living being. Whether through the tragic fall of the Eldar, the chaotic energy of the Orcs, or the cold, calculated rejection of the Necrons, the warp shapes the fates of these races in ways that are as complex as they are unpredictable. The warp does not simply exist. It interacts, it influences, and in many ways it dictates the course of history for the creatures that inhabit the galaxy. And as long as the warp exists, the galaxy will remain in its thrall. The relationship between the Eldar and the warp is as ancient and tragic as the galaxy itself. At the height of their power, the Eldar were a race of beings who seemed to have mastered everything: technology, the warp, even the very fabric of reality itself. They were a psychic race, their minds intertwined with the immaterium, and they wielded this power with a sophistication that no other species could hope to match. But in the end, their mastery of the warp became their undoing, giving rise to one of the most catastrophic events in the history of the galaxy: the fall of the Eldar. Before the fall, the Eldar were a glorious civilization, spanning across a vast number of worlds, each one filled with unimaginable beauty and advanced technology. Their cities were marvels, their ships capable of traversing the stars with ease. They understood the warp intimately, using it to power their ships, to fuel their creations, and to extend their lives. They were the apex of psychic ability, harnessing the warp not just as a tool, but as an extension of themselves. It's hard to imagine a time when the Eldar were the very definition of perfection, when they were the rulers of the galaxy, and the warp was simply another part of their reality. They were not just masters of the warp, they were its stewards, shaping it to their will. But as with all things in Warhammer 40k, perfection is always fleeting, and the Eldar's arrogance in their mastery of the warp would come to haunt them in a way they could never have predicted. The very power that made them great would also be their downfall. In their pursuit of ever greater pleasures and indulgences, the Eldar began to push the limits of what the warp could offer. They reveled in their psychic powers, using them to shape their cities, manipulate their reality, and satisfy their deepest desires. The more they indulged, the more they lost themselves to the madness that the warp could breed. The Eldar's descent into decadence was swift, and it was their obsession with indulgence that gave birth to Slaanesh, the chaos god of excess. The creation of Slaanesh was a cataclysmic event in the history of the Eldar. The birth of this new god tore apart the very fabric of Eldar society. Slaaneish's arrival was not just a single event, it was a massive psychic rupture that shattered the Eldar psyche. In an instant, a majority of the Eldar race was consumed by Slaanesh, their souls devoured by the new god of excess. The psychic shockwave created by the birth of Slaanesh opened a massive rift in the warp, creating what would become known as the Eye of Terror. The rift swallowed whole the homeworlds of the Eldar, leaving them a scattered and broken race. The Eye of Terror became the place of their greatest tragedy, the gaping wound in the warp that represents the fall of the Eldar, a reminder of the price of their own hubris. The creation of the Eye of Terror is a story that is as much about the power of the warp as it is about the fragility of the Eldar. The warp, it seems, has always had the potential to shape the fate of the galaxy, but it was the Eldar's arrogance and indulgence that allowed it to shape their fate so dramatically. For the Eldar, the Eye of Terror is a constant reminder of what they lost, of the civilizations, the lives, and the souls that were consumed by the power they sought to control. It is a symbol of the Eldar's failure, of their inability to balance their knowledge and power with restraint. The warp did not destroy the Eldar. They destroyed themselves, using the warp as a tool for their own excesses. In the aftermath of the fall, the Eldar were left in a state of ruin. Those who survived found themselves scattered across the galaxy, isolated from one another, and haunted by the memories of their once glorious civilization. They could never return to their former heights, for the warp had claimed too much from them. The greatest among them, the Phoenix Lords, led the surviving craft worlds, massive nomadic ships that carried the last remnants of their people. These craft worlds became their last hope, a place where they could regroup, rebuild, and protect themselves from the chaos of the galaxy. But even these sanctuaries were not immune to the influence of the warp. The Eldar may have escaped the immediate horrors of the fall, but they would never be free of the warp's grasp. It would haunt them forever, a constant reminder of their lost glory and the price of their excesses. The Eldar's relationship with the warp is one of both reverence and fear. They know, perhaps better than any other race, the power that the warp holds. They understand that their psychic abilities are a gift, but also a curse. The warp has the potential to be both a source of incredible power and a force of utter destruction. For the Eldar, the warp is something to be respected and feared, but it is also something they must use if they are to survive. The remnants of the Eldar, the craft worlds, have developed a way of harnessing the warp without succumbing to its darker influences. They use it to navigate the stars, to enhance their psychic powers, and to defend themselves from the forces of chaos. But even with their advanced knowledge and discipline, the warp still holds the potential to destroy them, just as it did before. The creation of the Eye of Terror is a mark of the Eldar's fall from grace, but it also serves as a reminder that the warp is not just a tool. It is an entity in its own right, capable of shaping the fate of entire races. The Eldar's downfall was not the result of external forces, but of their own inability to control the very power that they had mastered. The warp is alive, and it is as unpredictable and uncontrollable as any sentient being. The Eldar learned this lesson the hard way, and it is a lesson they will never forget. In the grand scheme of things, the fall of the Eldar is a tragedy that reflects the dangers of overreaching, of seeking power without understanding its consequences. It is a story of how the warp can shape not only individuals, but entire civilizations, and how even the most powerful beings in the galaxy are not immune to its corrupting influence. The Eldar's downfall is a cautionary tale for all those who would seek to harness the power of the warp, a reminder that even the greatest of civilizations can fall when they fail to respect the forces they seek to control. The Tyranids are one of the most mysterious and terrifying threats to the galaxy in Warhammer 40K. They arrived from the dark void between galaxies, seemingly immune to the usual chaos that affects most other races. while the other xenospecies, such as the Eldar or Orcs, are deeply intertwined with the warp, some embracing its dark powers, others resisting it. The Tyranids appear to be an anomaly. They are a race of biologically engineered, hive mind-driven creatures that seem, on the surface, utterly divorced from the chaos of the immaterium. They come from beyond the galactic boundaries, and their behavior is singularly focused on one thing: consumption. But what's the connection between the Tyranids and the warp? Are they truly immune to its influence, or is there something deeper and more sinister at play here? First, it's important to recognize that the Tyranids are not like any other race in the galaxy. Their biology, their entire method of existence, is based on consumption and adaptation. They are a swarm that devours everything in its path, assimilating genetic material from whatever they encounter. Each Tyranid is a part of the collective consciousness of the hive mind, a massive, ever-expanding intelligence that guides their every move. This collective consciousness doesn't seem to be rooted in the warp in the same way as other psychic powers or entities. Instead, it's a strange and unsettling mix of pure biological necessity and predatory instinct, but without the obvious psychic energy that permeates most other races. What's truly fascinating, however, is the way the Tyranids interact with the warp, or more specifically, how they seem to avoid its influence. Unlike the Orcs, whose Wa energy is a product of the warp and the collective psychic power of their species, or the Eldar, whose psychic powers are deeply tied to the immaterium, the Tyranids appear to operate outside of this influence. Their hive mind is not shaped by the warp. It seems to operate in a completely different way. The Tyranids do not use the warp for psychic power. Instead, their power seems to be more biological in nature, driven by their genetic imperatives and the constantly adapting nature of their swarm. But here's the catch. While the Tyranids may seem immune to the warp's usual influence, it's possible they are not entirely unaffected by it. Some theories suggest that the Tyranids are, in fact, drawn to the galaxy because of the warp. Their arrival coincides with the growing strength of the Chaos Gods, the growing instability of the galaxy, and the increasing psychic turmoil that pervades it. Could it be that the Tyranids are not immune to the warp, but rather that they are serving some greater purpose for it? Are they simply another instrument in the grand plan of the Immaterium, perhaps even serving the desires of the Chaos Gods in a way that we do not yet understand? The idea that the Tyranids might be a tool of the warp raises some unsettling possibilities. Consider this. The Tyranids are constantly consuming and adapting, but they do so with a strange, almost predatory precision. The warp, as we know, feeds on emotion, on psychic energy. The Tyranids, with their relentless hunger and ability to strip entire planets of their biological material, could be seen as an engine that feeds on the psychic energy of a galaxy teeming with powerful emotions. Could it be that the Tyranids are not just an external threat, but a method by which the warp is consuming the material universe, one species at a time? One theory that has been circulating among fans is the idea that the Tyranids are, in some way, a response to the overabundance of psychic energy in the galaxy. The growing power of the warp, fueled by the Chaos Gods and the psychic powers of the various races, has begun to cause instability. The Tyranids, as an external threat, could be the manifestation of the warp's hunger, a way for the Immaterium to cleanse the galaxy of the excess psychic energy that has accumulated over millennia. In this sense, the Tyranids may not be immune to the warp. They may be the warp's cleansing force, the natural consequence of a universe teeming with psychic power. But this is where things get even darker. If the Tyranids are, in some way, the warp's instrument, it means that they are not simply mindless devourers. They may have a purpose, one that serves the greater cosmic balance. Some theorists speculate that the Tyranids may be aware of the Chaos Gods, or at least be in competition with them. The Chaos Gods feed on emotion, But the Tyranids seem to feed on something much more fundamental: life itself. Could it be that the Tyranids are a natural counterforce to the warp's influence, a way for the universe to combat the growing power of the immaterium? Another theory suggests that the Tyranids might be in some way connected to the Necrons, the ancient race that rejected the warp in favor of a more material, technological approach to existence. The Necrons, after all, once rejected the warp and sought to escape its influence by transferring their consciousnesses into immortal machines. Could it be that the Tyranids, in their strange, relentless quest for consumption, are in fact a result of the Necrons' rejection of the warp? Perhaps the Tyranids are a reflection of what happens when a race completely turns its back on the immaterium, choosing instead to evolve into a purely material force. While there is no clear answer to the question of whether the Tyranids serve the warp or are immune to it, there is one thing that is certain. They are a force unlike any other in the galaxy. They are an alien intelligence driven by a singular purpose, and they are coming for the galaxy with an insatiable hunger that cannot be sated. Their connection to the warp may be a mystery, but their actions are clear. They consume, adapt, and evolve, constantly growing in power and influence as they devour everything in their path. And in doing so, they may very well be playing a role in the grand, cosmic struggle that is unfolding across the galaxy, a struggle that may have far-reaching consequences for the fate of the entire universe. The warp is far more than just an isolated dimension. It is a force that actively influences the material universe. It is a constant presence in the lives of every sentient being, and its power shapes the very fabric of reality. Whether it's the fate of entire galaxies, the rise and fall of empires, or the ultimate destinies of species, the warp is always there, pulling the strings, influencing events, and turning the wheels of destiny. It is the great unseen force that shapes the course of history, often in ways that no one can fully understand, let alone control. One of the most obvious ways the warp interacts with the material universe is through the psychic powers of individuals. Psykers, those rare individuals born with the ability to tap into the warp's energy, can shape the world around them, alter the course of battles, and change the fate of nations. But the power of the warp comes with a price. Psykers are constantly at risk of being consumed by the very force they draw upon, falling into madness, corruption, or worse, becoming puppets for the chaos gods themselves. It is through this influence that the warp has its most immediate and personal impact on the material universe. Psykers are not only warriors, healers, or sages. They are conduits for the warp's energy, and in doing so, they are subject to its whims. This influence is most profoundly felt within the Imperium of Man, where the use of psychic powers is both a necessary tool and a dangerous liability. The Imperium relies heavily on Psykers for its survival. The Astronomicon, the psychic beacon that guides Imperial ships through the warp, is powered by the Emperor's own psychic strength, and thousands of Psykers are used to maintain the Imperium's vast infrastructure. Yet, as essential as Psykers are, their power is also a constant threat. The more they use the warp, the more they risk being consumed by it. Every time a Psyker taps into the warp, they risk being overwhelmed by the chaotic forces that lurk just beneath the surface. For the Imperium, the use of psychic power is a double-edged sword. Its strength is essential, but it is also a reminder of how fragile their control over the warp truly is. Beyond the Psykers, the warp's influence on the material universe is most clearly seen in the rise and fall of civilizations. The history of the galaxy is filled with empires and species that have either fallen to the power of the warp or been shaped by its influence. The Eldar, once a mighty civilization, were consumed by their own indulgence in the powers of the warp, leading to the cataclysmic fall that shattered their empire. The birth of the Chaos. God Slanesh created the Eye of Terror, a rift in the fabric of the warp that continues to plague the galaxy. The birth of this god not only destroyed the Eldar's golden age, but also set the stage for the eternal conflict between the forces of chaos and the Imperium of Man. The warp also influences the galaxy in more subtle ways. The Chaos Gods who reside in the Immaterium feed on the emotions and desires of mortals, using their power to shape events across the galaxy. Khorne, the god of war, thrives on violence and bloodshed, and his influence can be seen in the constant state of war that plagues the galaxy. Tzeentch, the changer of ways, feeds on ambition, manipulation, and change, subtly influencing the political landscapes of the galaxy, sowing discord and encouraging betrayal. Nurgle, the Lord of Decay, feeds on despair, disease, and entropy, slowly wearing down the fabric of reality itself, one soul at a time. Slaanesh, the Dark Prince of Pleasure, feeds on excess and indulgence, encouraging beings to pursue their desires without regard for consequence. In each case, the Chaos Gods are not merely passive observers of the material universe. They actively shape its course, pushing it toward chaos, destruction, and decadence. The rise of chaos is not limited to the forces of the Imperium or the Eldar. Other species, such as the Orcs, the Tau, and even the Necrons, have all felt the influence of the warp in different ways. The Orcs, for example, are not consciously aware of the warp's power, but they are nevertheless influenced by it. Their psychic abilities, their Wa energy, is a manifestation of the warp's power, allowing them to shape reality through sheer belief. The Tau, on the other hand, are a race that actively rejects the influence of the warp. They are a race of materialists, focused on technology and logic, yet even they cannot escape the pull of the Immaterium. Though the Tau may not rely on psychic powers, the warp still plays a role in their downfall, as they struggle to maintain control in a galaxy dominated by chaos. Perhaps the most tragic example of the warp's influence on a species is that of the Necrons. The Necrons were once a race of highly advanced beings whose mastery over the material universe rivaled that of the Eldar. But when they sought to escape the ravages of time and death, they turned away from the warp, rejecting its powers in favor of a more material, technological existence. In doing so, they cut themselves off from the very forces that govern reality. The Necrons' rejection of the warp came at a great cost. They transformed themselves into immortal machines, their souls severed from the Immaterium, leaving them hollow shells of their former selves. But even in rejecting the warp, the Necrons were not free from its influence. The Citan, the star gods they served, were beings of immense power that originated from the warp, and the Necrons' technology is still shaped by its presence. The Necrons' struggle is one of constant tension. Their rejection of the warp has made them immune to its corrupting influence, but it has also left them in a state of perpetual emptiness. The warp's influence on the material universe is also seen in the constant ebb and flow of power throughout history. The rise of powerful empires and the fall of civilizations are often shaped by the interplay of psychic power and the warp's influence. The Age of Strife, a period of galactic chaos, was a time when the warp's influence reached its peak. The galaxy was torn apart by warring factions, psychic storms, and the rise of powerful warp entities. The Emperor of Mankind, in his quest to unite humanity, sought to bring order to this chaos, to impose a semblance of stability on a galaxy teetering on the brink of destruction. But even the Emperor could not escape the influence of the warp. His efforts to suppress psychers and control the Immaterium were a constant battle, and the rise of chaos during the Horus Heresy proved that the warp's influence could not be fully contained. In the end, the warp's influence on the material universe is one of profound complexity and contradiction. It is a force that shapes the galaxy, not through direct control, but through subtle manipulation and influence. It is a reflection of the emotions, desires, and fears of all living beings, and it has the power to shape their fates in ways that no one can fully predict. Whether through the psychic powers of individuals, the rise and fall of civilizations, or the schemes of the Chaos Gods, the warp is a constant presence in the material universe, shaping events in ways that are as unpredictable as they are inevitable. The galaxy may be vast and full of wonders, but it is also a place where the warp's influence is never far behind, pushing everything toward its ultimate end. As we reflect on everything we've explored about the warp, it's clear that it is more than just a mysterious dimension or a tool for faster-than-light travel. It is a living, breathing entity in its own right, shaping the fates of galaxies, species, and individuals. Its influence touches every aspect of the Warhammer 40K universe, from the rise and fall of empires to the existence of the Chaos Gods themselves. The warp is both a source of incredible power and a force of unimaginable destruction, and no one, whether human, Eldar, Orc, or otherwise, can escape its grasp completely. The relationship between the warp and the material universe is a complex one. On one hand, it is a source of strength and survival. Without the warp, humanity would never have spread across the stars. But on the other hand, the warp is a force that can twist, corrupt, and consume those who seek to harness it. The Tyranids, the Necrons, and the other races are all impacted by the warp in their own ways, some falling prey to its influence, while others try to resist it, sometimes at great cost. The creation of the Eye of Terror, the fall of the Eldar, and the rise of the Chaos Gods are all examples of how deeply the warp shapes the galaxy. And yet, for all we know, there are still countless mysteries left to uncover. Is the warp truly alive, as some believe? Does it have a greater purpose, guiding the events of the material universe toward an unknown end? Or is it merely a reflection of the emotions and desires of the beings within it? A chaotic and unpredictable force that will continue to shape the galaxy for as long as it exists? As we look to the future, we must acknowledge that the warp will remain a constant force in the 40K universe. It is something that will continue to shape the destinies of those who come into contact with it, whether they embrace its power or fear its influence. The warp is as much a part of the galaxy as the stars themselves, and its mysteries will continue to intrigue and terrify us for generations to come. But this is just one perspective, one interpretation of the warp's role in the galaxy. The beauty of the Warhammer 40K universe is that it leaves so much open to speculation and theory. There are countless other interpretations of the warp's true nature, and the lore surrounding it is rich with possibilities. I'd love to hear your thoughts and theories on the warp. Do you think it's truly alive, or is it just a reflection of the forces at play within the galaxy? Do you think the Tyranids are a part of some greater warp plan? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and let's continue the conversation. And if you enjoyed diving into the depths of the warp with me, don't forget to subscribe for more explorations into the mysteries of the Warhammer 40K universe.